Morning, everybody. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes and then we'll get this thing kicked off. Right, okay, well, I think we'll kick this thing off. So firstly, welcome to everybody who's joined our webinar this morning. I hope the next 40 minutes to an hour is going to be of interest to everybody. And of course, subject being next gen rendering webinar. And I'm happy to introduce the panel that we have today, which is consists of the ERA MD, Sean Baker, the sales director of NTI Bluegfx, Lee Phillips, and very happy to also introduce Borja Huertas, who is the IT manager of Giant Animation, who are a customer of ERA, who was introduced through Tyrell over in Ireland. So I just want to throw it to them all to introduce themselves. So I'll take this to you, Sean, first.
Yeah, hi, good morning, everybody. As Paddy said, I'm Sean Baker. I'm the Managing Director here at ERA. I've been working in the media entertainment industry for far too long now, and in that time worked with many VFX and post-production companies, so have quite a lot of experience around render workflows and how those clients use render systems. Lee?
Yeah, hello everyone. Lee Phillips from NTI Bluegfx. We've been around previously as Bluegfx for 25 years in the media space, and we was recently acquired by a European company called NTI, who specialise more in the manufacturing and architectural side, but still on the IT and software side, which is where we're sort of sat in the media space. Borja,
do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, morning everyone. My name is Borja. I'm the IT manager here in Giant Animation. Giant is a studio based in Ireland. We do full CG, whether it's episodic animation or features. We usually work with big clients like Disney, Netflix, Nickelodeon, and we've been around for 15, 20 years. And yeah, I'm very excited. I'm happy to be here today.
Great stuff. Thank you, all three. So we're going to start with Borja. He's going to talk through how he's worked with ERA over the last year or so, how they approached us in the first instance, and then how the results and the solutions that they've used have gone for them. So Borja, over to you.
Thank you, Paddy. Yes, so Giant Animation, I suppose up to the pandemic, up to like 2020, we were all in-house, all in a studio, and we will have run all our infrastructure by ourselves. We will have done a little bit of forced rendering to the cloud, maybe some offsite backups into the cloud as well, but it will have been very limited use. Then the pandemic hit and that radically changed the business. Suddenly, all our artists were remote all over the world, and it kind of felt there wasn't a real reason why we had to run all our infrastructure in-house anymore, certainly not the rendering. And parallel to this, we were going through a period of growth where we were getting more and more projects of simultaneous productions, and we just didn't have like the resources or the capacity to serve all these projects. So that's when we started looking at options to see what it would take for us to either fully migrate into the cloud or have a hybrid approach where perhaps we'll run some productions in-house and other in the cloud. We did, or we had several conversations with public cloud providers and private cloud providers. And the problem with the public cloud, certainly back then, was there was a high level of complexity that it felt it was beyond our reach to fully migrate to a public cloud. And also from a cost perspective, there wasn't a whole lot of transparency or clarity on what we will take or what it will cost to run, let's say, a production in the cloud, in the public cloud. We had conversations with ERA through Tyrell, which is our technology provider here in Ireland. And immediately it felt it was a much better solution for us. It was a similar model to what we will have in the studio, in the sense like we will get a workstation and that will be a dedicated high performance workstation for our artists that an artist could use during the day, but we could use for rendering, for example, during the evenings. We will have a dedicated render farm that it will have a lot of flexibility. It will grow and shrink as the project demanded, or depending on client nodes or the complexity of the episodes we were working on. And then other things like storage, whether it was primary or for disaster recovery, virtual machines, everything had a very tangible feeling, if that makes sense. It was certainly a very easy transition for us to go from running all our infrastructure in-house to where we are now, which was more of a 50-50 split. Like we will still have some of our legacy hardware in-house, but like we will have loads of workstations, rendering, storage with ERA, which allow us to run more than one production in the cloud. And that's been extremely helpful for us over the last 18, nearly 2 years now, I think we're working together.
Yeah, fantastic, Borja. Thanks for that. I think one of the things we're going to do right now, just to give the guys an understanding of the audience, is do a quick poll. So there you go, it's on the screen. So if you can just tell us how you currently handle your rendering workload, we'll just give it 20 seconds or so, and then we'll have a quick look at the outcome. All righty, cool. Thanks for that. Well, it looks pretty overwhelmingly one-sided here, and we're talking on-premise render. So I'm just going to throw that to Sean, just to give some comment on that.
Yeah, thanks, Paddy. Yeah, no, it's interesting. I was surprised. I thought it was going to be a little bit more mixed from the on-premise and cloud usage of render. So interesting to see that the majority of people, certainly on this call, are still using on-premise render. So gives us an opportunity to sort of give an idea of the benefits and the simplicity of using render services within the cloud. I think there's been a lot of reluctance over the last few years around complications of managing data within the cloud from a render perspective, connectivity, performance, or just managing the costs associated with it. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how that comes out as we talk over the next 40 minutes or so. Portia, how did you find? Because I guess before you started working with us, you were predominantly all on premise from a render perspective as well. So how have you found the move to using cloud render services?
Yes, as I briefly mentioned earlier, until we started working with you, 99% of our rendering will have been done in-house. We will have done a tiny little bit of posting into the cloud, but it will have been very reactive in the sense like it was never planned for. It was more suddenly we're halfway through production. We get a high volume of notes from a client, and that kind of like throw us over what our capacity was, and we have to very quickly pivot into the cloud. But for us as well, one thing that happened on the last 18 months when we started working with you guys was Giant Animation was primarily a GPU-based studio. Redshift was a render engine of choice up to that point. But now we've started working with Arnold, so we're doing both GPU and CPU rendering. But our in-house render farm was all GPUs. That's how we built it over the years because that was the render engine we were most used to. So being able to work with you guys to deploy a brand new render farm that was a CPU based was extremely helpful because it didn't mean we have to suddenly build a brand new farm just for a specific project. Like we will not have been able to use our existing setup and it would just have been like basically unable to do within the budget for this particular production. So that was incredibly helpful. And another thing that we found the cloud extremely helpful was in the past when we were looking at some forecasting for the capacity of our farm. It's always a tricky battle because obviously you want to make sure you have enough capacity before you start the project, but it's not really until you are halfway through the project when you have accurate data and accurate numbers on what your capacity needs actually are. And it's a tricky balancing act where with ERA, we were able to have a number of nodes, maybe on a longer term commitment. But then if we started working on an episode that was of a higher complexity and had higher demands for the rendering, we were able to quickly spin up much more capacity. I think at one point, like we nearly double or triple the capacity for a shorter period of time, get that complex episode or project out of the way, and then go back down. So that flexibility of scaling up and down as the project demand, it's been extremely helpful because it's not something like we will have been able to do in the past. In the past, we would have had to either compromise on quality, which is obviously something you never want to do, or push delivery deadlines, or I don't know, pull a rabbit out of a magic hat and try to figure out how you're going to solve that problem. So definitely now we have a lot more flexibility on the rendering. That is something we never had in the past.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Hopefully there weren't too many rabbits coming out of hats during that process. Who knows? But I mean, that's a good segue. You mentioned a few things there: software, GPU, CPU, and it's probably a good segue then into Lee, who's the sales director of NTI Blue, and bring you in. Lee's just going to do and cover the evolution of rendering technology. So Lee, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Paddy. Yeah, no, I think as Borja mentioned there, I mean, one of the questions we get asked a lot is this CPU, GPU, which one's best? And I don't think there is a definitive answer to that at the moment. I think it's very much driven by software choice of the studios. As Borja mentioned, there's Redshift predominantly GPU, Arnold predominantly CPU, so they've sort of shifted their render process based on the software that they're using. And I think what we're seeing through the market is smaller studios are slightly more agile and can take advantage of enhancements in different softwares at maybe quicker than they can in a bigger studio. But it's a big investment for anyone to bring either CPU processing power or GPU processing power in-house. So looking at it from a cloud base, be that public or private, is becoming increasingly more popular to at least understand the costs involved in that. And I think what we see is that generally there's a lack of knowledge, but a lack of understanding of costs, some hidden costs around a lot of this cloud-based stuff. So with the ERA solutions, there's a bit more understanding of how, Sean, you can probably you add to that in terms of where the costs are a little bit more visible than they might be on some unnamed public cloud platforms that you get sort of a big bill at the end of the month because you don't know what you've used, whereas there's a bit more predictability. But it's about planning as well. It's not about the poll was quite interesting because it was a lot of the audience is on-prem, but we're also seeing a lot of people outsource to third parties, especially when they get to what I like to call the oh dear moment of, oh dear, I don't think I'm going to get this rendered in time. So they then look for immediate additional processing power, whatever it is, to get the job done on time. And a bit of planning and pre-thought about how that you can take advantage of that to scale up and scale down. I think, Sean, is that something that's similar that you probably see from the hardware side as well? Is it's always a little bit at the last minute rather than planning for this as a tool to benefit from in the future.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we put things together in such a way that the costs are predictable. I guess I'm interested from the software perspective, what you see, whether you see a drive in the software side to do more GPU rendering than CPU. I think from an ERA perspective, we are seeing an increased demand for GPU rendering.
Yeah,
we're predominantly, our estate is predominantly CPU, but we are growing our GPU estate. But definitely seeing more demand over that from the last 6 months. Have you seen that echoed in the software space?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the evolution of things like Unreal and Unity and those real-time engines that are really take advantage of the GPUs rather than the CPUs. So we're seeing that, but I say it's still massively software dictated in terms of people's pipelines. I think in a media space, if you go to the bigger VFX houses, Borja is a classic example of this. Arnold has some GPU aspects to its rendering, but it's predominantly a CPU renderer. And we see sort of, Arnold is probably one of the bigger renderers within that space. Used to be RenderMan a lot as well, which was still CPU based. But it is, it's evolving massively, and we drag in the AI word as well into some of this, and what that evolution of the software now over the next 3, 4, 5 versions is going to be driving, I think, into dare I say it, into this sort of hybrid model of CPU, GPU irrelevant. It's which software, which pipeline am I going to utilize to get the best for this particular job. And I think that's the key here is the interoperability between software over the years has become so much easier to move between products, platforms, renderers. Boyer probably disagreed slightly, but it's in a smaller studio setup, it's easy to flip between various various DCCs and various renderers, and just taking advantage of the best of all worlds, basically, rather than being very rigid and not changing your pipeline at all.
In my opinion, the future is certainly GPU. Like there's no doubt about it. Like on one hand, like what will have been traditionally GPU-based render engines like Redshift, their quality is getting higher and higher. Like 5, 10 years ago, maybe there was a compromise. There was only so much you could do with Redshift, and you could certainly achieve a higher quality with Arnold. And that gap is getting smaller every day. Then, as you mentioned, Lee, you have the real-time engines like Unreal and Unity, which are getting a bigger footprint in media and entertainment as well. And then the last thing is the traditional CPU-based engines like Arnold or RenderMan. They both now have GPU support as well. And while the GPU performance maybe is not quite there yet, it's certainly the direction it's taking. So I've no doubt, at least myself personally, like a GPU is where everything is going to be in the next few years. The other thing I wanted to mention about GPU is the problem with GPUs, especially in the public cloud, is there's a high demand for them. GPUs are far more limited than CPUs, and then the GPUs are also used for virtual workstations, for machine learning and AI and all those trainings. So when you approach a big cloud provider, the GPU that they might be able to guarantee is not as high as you like to think coming from a big public cloud provider, because obviously they are not just in the media and entertainment space. They have many clients from many other sectors, and all of those people are fighting for GPUs, whether working with a technology partner like ERA, which is solely focused in our sector. There is a lot more guarantees or possibilities to have conversations about like your capacity needs and then plan for that. Yeah, certainly I think GPU is where it's at. I'm a fan.
A curious question from me, and Lee or Bush, you might have an opinion on this. From a GPU perspective with software, are the software vendors creating their applications to make use of multi-GPU systems, or are people better to design their workstations with larger GPUs and have more single GPUs in a wider spread of machines? Lee, I don't know whether you've got an idea.
Yeah, well, are they developing it for multi-GPU? It is a good question. I don't know the answer to. Yeah, we'd have to ask the developers themselves, really. But I mean, I think there's limitations around how many cards you can get into. How many cards you can get into a system. The manufacturers are putting restrictions on certain cards that you can get into certain systems, and data centers have limitations on the GPU cards that can go in various places. But so people are making a sort of a bodging it together is the wrong word, but building their own systems with and sticking cards in, and they're blowing up. And Boyer mentioned it with the Redshift. When they were using Redshift as well, is the overall quality was lower. So you used Redshift in sort of 5 years ago on. We saw it a lot in stylized. We saw it a lot in the kids' TV space, where it was super fast, but it was a lower quality stylized cartoony rather than high-end visuals, which still needed the GPU. So as we evolve, and I think Boyer's right in terms of GPU is where they're going to end up, but I think it does rely on the software to catch up with taking advantage of that. And that's, GPU rendering's been around for a longer than probably a lot of people think, to be fair. And I remember seeing something from Intel, I think about 15 years ago, and it was so clunky, it was unusable on a day-to-day basis. So it's been evolving over time, and I think it'd be quite interesting to see now with AI enhancements and stuff like that taking over. Is there a benefit then of are we going to see it move maybe quicker over the next 5 years than we have previously over the last 10 or 15?
So do you go on? Sorry.
No, I was gonna say we we certainly have systems with 16 GPUs in the render nodes, and it's not a linear equation. Like they are not 16 times faster than a node with a single GPU. There's a little bit diminishing returns in there, but like a lot of software these days scales up pretty well, especially when you're looking into rendering purely compute. If you have 16 GPUs in one node, you can expect almost like that 16x performance. But I think on GPUs, where the main limiting factor has been in the past is the amount of memory. Like obviously for Arnold or CPU base, you can stick 120 gigs, 256 gigs, like half a terabyte of RAM on a machine and render very complex scenes where the VRAM on GPUs, especially on the consumer end of GPUs, is much more limited, and that would have been a ceiling we've hit in the past, where we will have to break down scenes that were very complex into different subsections because we just couldn't fit everything into memory. So I think like where things are going is probably not necessarily more GPUs or faster GPUs, is just bigger GPUs with more memory that allow you to, as I was saying earlier, bridge that gap between the final output quality of CPU and GPU rendering. We are pretty much there now. Like we can do full groom, full hair, like high poly on GPU these days, and get fantastic results.
I think the interesting thing there, boy, it leads us on to the next point, which is all about scalability and the power on demand. So I think you talked there a little bit about availability, especially with the public cloud. So, but we'll throw this on to Sean just to give us a few points on this.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting subject about how on-demand render and scalability can be used. And as I say, the poll that started at the beginning of our webinar here, where most of the audience is using on-premise, is for me probably means that there's concerns around how that scalability can be accessed and controlling the costs if you're accessing cloud-based rendering. I think I can really talk about it from an ERA perspective. It's been a goal for us. Most of our customers are media and entertainment focused, so and we deal with a lot of animation and VFX houses. And one of the biggest challenges that they've told us that they were facing is managing that on-demand render requirement and particularly controlling the costs. Rendering tends to be as everyone will know, I suspect, tends to be a thing that happens at the end of a project at a large scale, and quite often people find themselves in the position where they don't have enough. And public cloud allows you to burst in and spin up lots of render CPU machines, potentially even GPU machines, but it becomes very difficult to control the costs at that point. So, you know, we spent some time thinking about that, and we've built CPU and GPU render systems to allow our client base to sort of have a very predictable cost base and give them a lot of flexibility in being able to spin that resource up on demand to meet requirements. We're of course not an Amazon and GPS. We don't have unlimited quantity of CPU, but we have a large amount, and if we're working with people, then normally we can pre-allocate and pre-plan and make sure that there's render capability available at a fixed price. That means everyone, when they start a project, can understand what the rendering costs are likely to be, and if you need to scale them to a particular level, it becomes very predictable. The other challenge I think lots of people face when they're looking at rendering in the cloud is just how you get your data to those render nodes, and that depends a lot on where a client is based, where they're accessing the cloud, what their rendering type is, whether it's particularly I/O intensive or renders or CPU intensive, I should say. The more CPU intensive or more GPU intensive and the less IO, it lends itself more potentially to rendering in the cloud. But we do have clients that can render on 20 or 30 very high-end machines with a decent internet connection. I think if you're getting to a larger scale than that, and depending on your location, then you need to be considering how we manage data and how we manage workflow, and that's conversations that we have often with clients. I think in Borja's case, and I can probably bring him in here a little bit just to, he's probably already talked about it, so we won't go into too much detail, but Borja obviously has been working on a large project for the last 18 months, and from their perspective, it made a lot of sense to put the data where the render and workstations was. So the data remained in that one place, but he could burst up render and burst up workstations as and when he needed it. I don't, Borja, you want to give a little bit of detail on that?
Yeah, and I think data is the key, like in the public cloud, or like, like bursting and spinning 10,000 CPUs is all fine and great, but like how you get the data there and back, and what are the costs associated with that as well. That's where things start to break down very quickly. For ourselves with ERA, like the fact that we had some local storage that was sitting besides the render nodes, it made all the difference, because it meant we could cache that data. The data was there, accessible to all the render nodes, and it was very easy to manage from a workflow point of view. Like it just was transparent, like basically. Where on other setups I've used in the past, it certainly hasn't been as easy as. So certainly having the option to have some network storage on the same ecosystem as you're rendering, to me, definitely makes all the difference, because it takes that complexity out of the equation. Like suddenly your cloud rendering behaves the same way as your in-house render farm, and all you need to do is have a little bit of a sync, whether it's automatic or through your pipeline of the particular assets you need for any rendering at any given time between those two locations, which is an easy problem to solve. And yeah, it just makes things that much more simple. Yeah, that's the word.
Yeah, I think it's. I think in the last few years, it's been in the realms of some of the big storage vendors. So you're having to invest heavily into storage to give yourself access to those cloud services if you want to do it at any scale. I think times are changing there in that space. I think there are some tools appearing in the market that are storage agnostic and are in a price point that makes it reasonable to still be able to have a workflow on premise and burst into the cloud with a little bit of tweaking to how you might manage that data. But I think the tools are appearing to allow that to happen now. I think Lee, I mean, what have you seen from your client base? I know that our audience here is predominantly on premise, but do you find your client base are pushing out to the cloud more from a rendering perspective?
It's certainly being looked at a lot more. I think the scalability thing here, I think, is quite interesting, because it's, if you look at a slightly smaller studio than maybe Giant are, and just some of those smaller studios, it comes into other costs start coming into play here in terms of what their current capacity is for render, and what does doubling their render capacity look like. In some instances, it's 2 additional CPUs, it's 2 additional GPUs, and they've got double that render capacity. So I think about the scalability of and something I mentioned earlier about that, just looking into it ahead of time, rather than waiting until you've got to a point where you need that additional render power, is what are the options for smaller medium studios to look at something, that ERA are providing, and have those conversations and have a bit of prep work and spend a bit of time investing in the ability to scale up, so that they can scale up much bigger than 1 or 2 when they do get to it, and potentially for a smaller cost. No one's going to say this is cheaper than doing it one way or another, because this is all ultimately about consumption. But I think, the hardware is there to be consumed. The software has evolved over the last few years into a consumption-based model. We're in a token flex world as well now, where we're, not just by the year, by the month, by the day, will we be by the hour, by the minute in software world too in the future. I can see that being, something that's not too far away. And for something like rendering in particular, that's going to be a real advantage to be able to pay for, as you said, the render power that you're using, or the render and the software for that render power, just for the period that you're rendering, because the rest of the time it's sat dormant, not being utilized. So I think that's what we're seeing, from those sort of SME guys, more so than the bigger studios that have got the budget, have got the in-house expertise. I think that's the other thing as well. I think there's that, not everyone's got a render wrangler to help on a day-to-day basis. So where do we look, and how can we help with those guys with that additional power? And cloud is becoming, offsite cloud is becoming more and more of a conversation.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
I think we're going to go back to the others now and do another poll just to get some feedback based on them. And we're going to ask people what we think their biggest challenges with their rendering today. Clearly, we know that most of this is on-prem, but we'll just give that 30 seconds and ask you all just to give us some feedback, if that's good.
Oh, that one moved around a bit more.
Early level, yeah.
Yeah, that one definitely moved around a bit more, so that's much more spread.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting sustainability kicked in there at the end. So well done, you guys who were wearing green today. So I think we're gonna
very happy to see that.
To Borja to give us some comments on what he faced and how that sort of marries up with what the poll says. Borja, over to you.
Yes, certainly on scalability. Lee was saying earlier, like for smaller studios, like cost can be an issue, but that's not to say that on bigger, medium-sized studios, like maybe the budget might be there to buy more GPUs or buy more render nodes. Like for example, one challenge we faced was we couldn't get enough power in our office, in our facility. Like we had conversations with the electricity supplier in here, and there was just no way we could have enough power to grow or render farms. So sometimes you have these challenges where it's not necessarily about budget or having more machines. Is like you literally will have to move to a different facility once you reach certain thresholds, or get a substation installed, which then you're talking like ridiculous amount of money. So the scalability can become a real challenge at certain scales, and that's where the clouds is the best solution, because you can move on all those problems to somebody else. It's suddenly not your problem anymore. And render times and high cost, absolutely, that'll always be there. GPUs, CPUs, everything is getting faster, but then the expectation from clients for you to render more complex or better looking pictures. So render times never go down. Like I've been doing this for 20 years, and it just feels like no matter how fast things get, like your render times never go down. So it takes a lot of fine-tuning your workflows and your approval process to control those render times, which obviously has a direct impact on the cost of your rendering. But things like Dee mentioned, the licensing models changing, where now you can get Arnold licenses by the month or by the day, or maybe in the future by the minute, is helping to keep the cost down, because the cost for rendering is not just the compute power alone, it's all those render licenses which can add up over time.
Also, I'm curious on your side, because you're actually doing this. Do you put any controls over the artists about how they design frames and that kind of thing?
Oh, absolutely. And we are not quite there yet, like, because traditionally rendering is something that we will have been seen as free. You just render. You have X amount of render power, and you just render. But then, no, like, we'll always, for example, we'll do like the basics, like a first, middle, and last frame of a sequence, get that approved, and then render the whole sequence, or every 10 frames, or things like that. So it's something that you actively have to manage, and that doesn't matter whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. Like, perhaps more relevant in the cloud, because like, suddenly rendering may not be as free as and that's one of the things that we actually found useful of working with ERA. It was a happy medium, like on the public cloud, where you are normally paying, let's say, by the minute or by the hour. Every little mistake you make is costing you money, so you have to be 100% on top of your approval policies and your procedures to make sure you are wasting as little as possible. Where with ERA, it was more like a fixed monthly cost, or with a token system. So it was a little bit more forgiving than the public cloud. And we will hope that our...
I was just going to say, Borja, on that point, I think you kind of neatly led us already into the next sort of segue, which is all about cost efficiency and the smart resource management. So I think interestingly, we kind of got there just through natural conversation. We let that flow.
I was doing my own introduction there, Paddy.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, like I said, just get the slide up so we know kind of where we're going on the thread. But Sean and Borja, continue talking.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, apologies. No, the last thing I was going to say, going back to the previous slide, just so it doesn't go unanswered, like the complexity, I did mention this earlier, but certainly for us, the complexity of ERA and the private cloud was much, much smaller than the public cloud in regards of how you manage your fleet of render nodes and transfer data and things like that. It was much easier with ERA.
Yeah, I think that was the key for me. I think from a VFX or an animation house, you first got to understand how long it takes to render and have some controls over your frame, so you can be predictable from a rendering perspective. But then we fully understand the need to be able to transparently budget or understand your budgets when it comes to the rendering process. And I think it's complicated when you come to render in a public cloud. You've got to understand how much data you are putting in and out of the cloud, and you need to design your workflows very carefully to ensure that you're being as efficient as you can be with the movement of data. And as Borja was just saying, you also build by the hour or even by the minute. So mistakes can be costly and get out of control from that perspective. I think as we've put our solutions together, we've focused very much on predictability from a client perspective, and we have two models, which is a token-based model, which just gives some guaranteed access to our clients so that they have a guaranteed subscription model to access render whenever they need it, or an on-demand model. both models give the flexibility or the understanding of what that price is going to look like over a period of time. There is a cost for that render node for a month or for a week, with no other hidden costs, no ingest, no outgest costs. We would work with a client to understand what data needs to be moved, but those things don't necessarily come with a cost unless there's some form of application that just helps manage that data movement from a workflow perspective. But the cost predictability has to be there, otherwise I think it makes it a dangerous tool to try and use within a production workflow, and when you've got to work to a budget.
Yeah,
I think as well, that probably brings Lee in a little bit on preventing that over provisioning of render nodes, and what tools are out there from a monitoring or smart monitoring perspective to.
Yeah, I mean, this for me is a gap that really needs to be filled at the moment, and I can see it being filled by, you know, the buzzword, you know, AI tools, and this is a real sort of benefit, I think, where rather than artificial, it's automation. It's about, you know, what can we get to automate to actually monitor schedules, to reprovision assets, yeah, and take the best advantage out of those going forward. And there is some, again, costs involved in looking into that and doing it, but we're starting to see, I mean, I know Flow Production had formerly ShotGrid software has got some AI enhancements around their scheduling so that they can actively monitor and readjust schedules to get the best out of the users and what the users are doing based on things that happen during a project that are out of their control. And I think if we can get the same on the render farms as well, and get some of that data analysis to actually look at how previously you're using the render nodes, how previous projects are taking advantage, and when they're taking advantage, you can then start to provision correctly and scale up and down as you need to, so that you do get the best value out of the kit that you're getting, and therefore at the best value, best cost, best power consumption, so that you're becoming as sustainable as possible because it's compute. So compute does use power. Boy, I mentioned it already in terms of, we hear that a lot. A lot of offices don't have the capacity to handle just that many machines being plugged into their circuits, and then you throw
Lee, on
in
that
the
point,
heating element. Yeah.
I was just going to say, Lee, on that point, everyone's mentioning sustainability. I know it came up in the poll, 25% or whatever said that was one of their big challenge. I think that's the final piece we really want to touch on, I guess, in the main part of this webinar. So maybe if we just move onto that whole piece of sustainability. Again, throw it open. Maybe Sean, you want to lead that one about some of the.
I mean, just on that previous poll we did, it was quite interesting to see the spread of answers there. Again, surprising from my perspective, but it was nice to see sustainability pop up. I think from our perspective, it's been a big topic within ERA over the last 12 months, and we've been working quite hard to complete our B Corp processes as part of our sustainability commitments. But I think from a render perspective, as both Lee and Boer have mentioned, they're power hungry, particularly the GPUs, the GPU systems. If you're installing large GPU systems, you're putting in specialty power in terms of the power feed sizes. You need a lot of cooling, which uses a lot of power, and all of those things can be a challenge from a client perspective to keep. And also, it's not probably the greenest way to use infrastructure from a rendering perspective when it's only needed at certain times. So I think that's where cloud really lends itself in terms of efficiency and sustainability. Data centers tend to be designed and built using greener power solutions. So I know in our case, everything sort of sits within the data center are 100% renewables, and also systems when they're installed within the data center are often focused around delivering the most power efficient models to run, because when you put when you're working in data center environment, it's very much costed around how that power is used and how that power is accessed. So it tends to drive efficiency in how systems are designed and put together. And I know as I look at across our estate that the rendering systems that we have, and we have a large estate of infrastructure ranging from all sorts of storage workstations and render. Render is the power hungry element of our infrastructure. So trying to make sure that we get the best use of power is a big driver for us.
And since you're just coming in on that point, Sean, I mean, we mentioned sustainability. I mean, ERA is going through the B Corp process. And one of the things we've learned, and one of the lessons we learned, is that actually measuring and knowing your consumption is actually, you know, is a big step towards sustainability. So it's not always about reducing it. It's actually understanding what you're using. And that's one of the big things that ERA as a business is going through right now. So.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a key factor, and we obviously have to understand it, particularly from our own cost-based perspective, but also to be able to provision that infrastructure to our clients as cost effectively as possible. We've got to understand where all those elements fit and how they're costed within that.
Yeah. Now, one of the points of order is we've got about 8-9 minutes left. If anyone's got any questions they want to drop in the chat, if we have got 5 minutes to the end, we'll try and run through some of those. So I'll say that now, probably a point of housekeeping that should have been made earlier. But I mean, the final bit really is about innovation in rendering tech. I don't know whether Lee and Borja want to just touch on that before we go to questions at the end.
I think, well, I mentioned it already. I think, you know, innovation is where where, you know, GPU, I think, is where it's going to, but not at the complete expense of, you know, you can't run a GPU without a CPU, so it's not going away completely. But I think for me, it's anyway. For me, it's and ultimately it's a processor. Yes. So for me, it's about the interoperability of software platforms. You know, you only have to go back, you know, Sean, I know, you know, we've been in this industry for a long time, that you never used to be able to even talk to someone that was using something slightly different. If you were doing you were using Maya, you couldn't yet talk to someone doing something else because they never really worked together. So it's now that's gone away. Once we take away barriers, then it's just about creating, and I think that's one of the best things to come out of, you know, this. I don't like the word AI. I like the word to use the word automation. If we can take some of the painful and the time-consuming problems out of the pipeline, then it leads more time to be more creative and for the users to be more creative. And I think that's where we can sort of really look at focusing on in that sustainability, and where we're going with stuff is, can we automate some of the time-consuming, costly processes and free up more time for the guys to create, you know, to spend creating, basically.
Yeah, for definite. Look, we've got a couple of questions. I mean, I think actually most of the topics we've covered, and the questions, I'll read them out. But first one's to Sean. Talks about, how does cloud rendering compare to traditional on-prem solutions in terms of energy efficiency? I think we have touched on that, but maybe just give us 20 seconds on that.
Yeah, I think it's just by design. I mean, obviously you're building render for a wider audience to use, so it's not built and sitting wearing away for one particular user's application that might only use it for 2 weeks a year. I think we're definitely building data centers that use the most efficient type of power. So whether that comes, you know, in the UK, certainly there's a big push to using renewables. So I know facilities that we're using are 100% renewable. And then I think in the future we'll see more liquid cooling and reduce the requirement for traditional air-cooled systems. And we'll see, certainly as the GPU and the AI workflows come into practice, I think there will have to be an embrace of liquid cooling technology. It's definitely not there yet, but it's definitely, I think, going to be required in the future.
Yeah, no worries. And the question for you, Lee, we've got, what role do you see automation playing in optimizing rendering costs and efficiency. I know you've talked about AI, but the actual role in optimization.
Yeah, I guess again, this is about data really, and just tracking what that usage is and how you've done stuff. So if there are tools being developed to be able to really track when the best, how much time's being used, when it's not being used. I think Sean sort of touched on it a little bit on why a render node in a data center that's being utilized by, because if you've got two machines exactly the same, they're using the same power when they're being used, but when it's when they're not being used and who's using them, and if you've got three machines that are sat there and are only being used 20% of the time each, you're better off having a single one that's being used by those three people at the same time. So for me, that's where you could, so that you're not wasting energy effectively and you're not wasting render, that you can tie down those smarter, faster render times, cutting out waste where you can effectively. But if anyone's written something like that, then please do let me know, because I know lots of people that would like to look at it.
Yeah, that's good. And Lee, you know what? You lead me into a great way to wrap up. I mean, we've got a white paper that's going to be coming out, which we'll share and will be available on the website. So talking about the written word. But I think that leads me really just into thanks, really. I'd like to thank the panel, Borja, Lee, and Sean, for giving us your time today. It's been an interesting hour. And again, thank you very much for your time.
Great.
No worries. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And thanks to those that attended. Thanks very much.